Welcome to the Beer Before Glory podcast. I'm your host, Justin Crossley.
And I'm Matt Brynildson.
And today we're talking Hazy IPA, probably almost everybody's favorite style, at least for the last couple years. It certainly depends on
there. We had to go there.
Yeah. 2 episodes into our Beer Before Glory podcast, and we went right for the good stuff with Hazy IPA. And so joining us today, Matt and I found 2 of not only our favorite brewers currently, but 2 of the best at making hazy beers in our opinions. And that's JC Hill from Alvarado Street. Welcome, JC.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate that.
Of course. And Neil Fisher from Weldwerks, which is out in Colorado. Greeley, right, Neil?
Greeley, Colorado, Northern Colorado. Thanks so much for having me too.
Yeah, great hazy brewers, great brewers in general. And I've gotten to taste quite a lot of the beers from each of you. I know Matt has too.
And brewers that typically share a little more information than the average East Coast hazy producer.
Yes. Matt and I talk about that a lot, where, not every guest is that forthcoming. And our idea behind this podcast was to really talk about the details. So that's what we want to do today, but we're going to cover a little bit about the style in general. But first, just so our audience knows, why don't we just get a little bit of background? Neil, how did you get into brewing? Were you a home brewer?
I started in my garage probably shortly after moving to Colorado in 2008, so 2009 or so. Started brewing in the garage, and then a few years later had some homebrew competition success. And one of the kind of buddies that was brewing with me at the time, my partner now, Colin Jones, kind of said, hey, if we had some success at a bigger competition, maybe we should open a brewery. And here we are almost 6 years later, and kind of been a wild ride, but certainly didn't set out to make IPA or anything, but that kind of was fun to navigate as we grew and changed and evolved.
Man, you hit the ground running. Like there's a lot of homebrewers turned pro, but you guys just really started getting accolades very soon, making great beer right out of the gate. So I'm sure it's been a whirlwind, because you guys just really hit the ground fast.
I remember coming out for one of the early, we were just talking about it, one of the early retreats for craft beer and brewing. And I think this was before you started your brewery, and you showed up and Jamie, the crew there. I mean, there was some foreshadowing. I think those guys knew you had the chops and, invited you in. And I remember tasting those beers, and yeah, you did hit the ground running for sure.
Thank you. That's a huge compliment. We had, I think that was kind of just from day one, that was kind of our focus. It was like, there's so many great breweries in Colorado. There's not really room to not come out with something, and not just, a single product, but everything you do has to be, up to those standards. So that was kind of our MO to start. And then we just figured out which styles resonated with our customers and what we loved, and started carving a niche in New England IPA for a little while. And that's kind of, I think, been something that really helped us grow a lot, but certainly not the only thing we're passionate about. But yeah, we've been really fortunate. It's hard to imagine, even that first, I think it was 2015 was that first GABF medal. And just, I think, when you open a brewery, even as a home brewer, you always want to open a brewery, you want to do all those things, but hitting those milestones quickly and then still finding more of them was crazy. I'm worried about the time when when we don't have anything else to work for, and as Matt's proven, you just keep winning more medals. So there's always more medals to win, as Matt's proven. So
yeah, I believe behind Matt is like a bucket of medals. He just has like a jar of medals somewhere. So
you can't wear them all at once.
If you're around long enough, you end up with a jar of medals.
Yeah. Well, how about you, JC, out here in California, your brewery, and just give us a little bit of your history. Before Alvarado, were you a pro or home brewer also?
Yeah, home brewer as well. Like Neil, started in the garage, San Diego, where I was living at the time, 2009, 2010, started home brewing. I opened up a restaurant in 2009. It was kind of like a fast casual rotisserie sandwich shop. With one of my good friends that I went to college with, which in our second location that we opened in 2011 became a brewery called Amplified Ale Works. And it was brewing on a little 3-barrel kit. It was basically like a glorified homebrew setup. I used to go to Home Brew Mart there in San Diego and go, talk to the ballast guys and actually like use they had a commercial mill. So I would just go in there with like, 6 bags of 2-row and use their mill and then go drink their beers. And then, it was a small brewery in the back of a kitchen. It was a great way to kind of cut my teeth and learn, a lot about the process. And then in 2014, I had the opportunity to come up to Monterey and open Alvarado Street Brewery with my dad. Downtown Monterey, we started with like a 10-barrel, brew kit with a restaurant. We opened our production brewery a couple years later, 2016. And that was to kind of augment, put more beer on tap at our pub. And then I started driving kegs up to Santa Cruz in the back of my truck. And, we ordered more tanks and started canning in, 2016. And it sort of took off. And I guess here we are today.
Excellent. You also have done very well. And I think I make fun of you a lot on all of the podcasts, JC.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
and to me, it's more
it's
okay. But to me, it's more making fun of myself that I'm just like not cool enough anymore. I don't get it. And that you get it. And to me, but
we are not cool though, by any means.
You're cool at not being cool though. And
yeah, okay, I'll take that.
Like you've carved out your niche as we don't have a niche. Like you do everything and stuff that even shouldn't be done, but people love it. I'm like, why did he do that? Why is JC doing this?
I agree.
People love it.
I agree.
Well, one of the moments I remember well was when you showed up at the Invitational with that jet ski converted into a draft box. I was like, man, these guys got game. I never thought of that.
That was incredible.
I spent way too much time on that. That was
right.
A lot of fun.
Well, and for here at the Hop Grenade, lots of people ask about lots of breweries, but there's only 2 breweries that get asked for every week. And I want to make sure we have it in. And that's, of course, Russian River, like every other bar on earth who carries Russian River or doesn't. They get asked every week if you have it. And it's Alvarado Street. I get calls about you every week. Most people have learned what your delivery date and time is each week. So they stopped calling, but the others are like, yeah, when are you getting Biggie's Bodacious Blueberry bullshit or whatever it's called, JC? I don't know.
Well, that's great. People are still, really, really into it. And
they are.
It's tough to kind of keep up, the excitement, but luckily it's a fun profession and a fun job. And there's always, ways we can make the liquid better. And there's also ways we can, do things that are, like make blue Hawaiian seltzers and, things that are abhorrent and sort of a traditional view.
Yeah. Well, I've been having a lot of fun with it. And to me, it's fun to watch, customers come in and know your beers by name, some of them have so many random ingredients in terms of traditional beer, and they know all about that stuff. And so it's actually, it's really fun. But I do like to make fun of you because I'm like, I don't know what he's making now.
Fair enough.
Okay, well, let's start talking hazy beer. And we do occasionally get juicy bits here, by the way, Neil. Every now and then you guys send some beer this way and we carry that too. And people also go crazy for that. If we get juicy bits, like I kind of put it on the shelf, sometimes we'll also get like a batch of a heady topper. And those beers are gone almost before I can put them on the shelf, So why don't we talk just a little bit about the origins of the style? So everybody knows what we're talking about with a hazy IPA. It's really probably the youngest style in terms of massive popularity anyway, to come out. And it, started in New England. It started out being called the New England IPA. And of course, hazy described immediately like how it looks. And it's evolved now. It's spread across the whole country like wildfire. And on our last episode, Matt, I think we even talked about how there's kind of subcategories of hazy now. Like some people are saying West Coast hazy is like kind of a new thing. Cellar Maker, I think, uses that term sometimes, right? So it's evolved into different things. And I also just want to point out that I think that to brewers anyway, and to savvy consumers, hazy IPA means more than what it looks like. it has a palate, it has a mouthfeel, it has a lot of other, there's juicy hazy IPA. And so I want us to get into kind of all of that. And that's just sort of the background, unless I missed anything that you guys know of about how we got here with hazy IPAs. So how about this? Neil, can you describe the characteristics of maybe the favorite hazy IPA that you make? What makes that a New England IPA or a hazy IPA to you?
Yeah, I think when we were developing Juicy Bits, it was, trying to get familiar with what that style was. I think it, obviously evolved from kind of Vermont roots to Massachusetts and kind of spread from there. It kind of went through iterations, but what really appealed to us back in, 2015, when we really started diving into it more, and I think we probably tried close to, 75 different, hazy or New England IPAs. And that's, end of 2015 before we started working on Juicy Bits. And it was clear we gravitated towards what was kind of the softer bitterness, what was kind of underlying on everything. And I think the mouthfeel component's a huge part too. So it's balancing, even if it has a little bit more assertive bitterness, it's balancing it with a little bit more full body, a little bit more kind of pronounced mouthfeel. Not necessarily an emphasis on malt, but maybe, not necessarily just trying to shove it in the corner and make the hops the sole focus. Okay. And we started to figure out what that looked like. And, but I think those two things in particular, like the kind of a more restrained and a little bit, less emphasis on bitterness, more on hop flavor and aroma was kind of what I always saw. And then just this really kind of unique mouthfeel. And those are the two, I think, characteristics that really struck us as is pretty different from what was in the market for IPA in general. Especially here in Colorado, we had really great producers, and those examples we tried really stood out as they were still IPA, still tons of hops, if not higher hop rates, but they drank a very, almost appealed to a wider audience because of those two factors.
Okay. And I wanted to ask about the yeast out of the gates, because I think I picked this up from JC more than anyone when I was trying to get my head wrapped around the style. Did you start with an alternative yeast, or did you try to employ your house yeast or whatever yeast you were most comfortable with, your West Coast IPA yeast?
We knew we wanted to change the yeast. That was the first, I think, kind of qualifier when we were designing the recipes. So we tried a lot of different ones, and it was, I think, a really strong emphasis on kind of British and English yeast in particular, which is where we landed on London Ale 3. But I think we knew we wanted a little bit less attenuation. We didn't want sweet, we didn't want cloying, we didn't want to finish it, we still wanted it to attenuate, but we wanted to kind of slow down and kind of temper the attenuation. And we also really wanted expressive. I think that we already talked about it earlier, but expressive yeast, I think, is an important factor as well, especially when you're complementing it with kind of complex fruity varietals of hops that, we're getting a lot of our fruit character from our yeast and our fermentations in Juicy Bits and some of our other IPAs. So that was a big factor for us too. So we ran the gamut of, the Conan strains and several different British strains, dry English and quite a few. And I think for us, London Ale 3 was that kind of perfect balance of kind of ester expression with, moderate attenuation, and could still, we could still get it to turn quickly enough where we were attenuating. We had a few yeasts that just took way too long to attenuate. And then we started to, extend those brew lengths, and just wasn't one, it wasn't sustainable. And two, we just couldn't maintain the hop freshness that we really liked about IPA. And so you start adding 3 to 4 days to fermentations, or even 2 and at the time. And it's, that one really struck the balance for all the what we wanted in the check boxes for all those factors. But it wasn't, I don't think we ever even tried a trial batch with our kind of American yeast. So it's really fun to see people experiment with totally. I've heard a lot of fun beers with Hefeweizen strains, which we do use Hef strain. So we should try that at some point as well. We just kind of landed in the British realm and never got out of that.
Matt, didn't you say that once? Like, oh yeah, we're just making Hefeweizens now. We're just calling that, or something to that effect. I mean, is there a reason that brewers didn't all just start using a Hefeweizen yeast to do this?
I mean, my opinion on that is the phenolics. So, a lot of those top fermenting yeast from Europe, specifically Hefeweizen yeast, produce a lot of phenolics. And I think that's something that's difficult to work with the rest of this. So you're really looking for this kind of more ester forward yeast. And yeah, if you could chop the phenolic gene out of the Hefeweizen yeast and just allow it to make isoamyl acetate and that banana aroma, that probably would work. Yeah. And, so I'm so curious because, JC, I think when I started getting into these beers, I was pinging you on yeast strains. I was trying to wrap my head around that. And, you had already experimented with a lot of things and mixed strains and stuff like that. So I'm kind of curious on what the journey has been for you with yeast. I know you've experimented with a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. I think for us, it was really, built on, aroma. And then from there, we could adjust the grist, adjust our mashing technique to kind of fall into that modern, I guess, hazy IPA profile. But in the early days with yeast, it was really, inspired by a trip, to the East Coast and having, Heady Topper Fresh and, going to Hill Farmstead, drinking those beers, and experimenting with the Conan strain. And that one was really amazing. And we used that for, at our pub for a number of years, I want to say. The original Contains No Juice and Vengeful Barbarians, another one of our more popular IPAs. Those were originally Conan-based hazy IPAs, but we kind of battled with consistency between generation to generation, and harvesting yeast for us is something we've always done, and kind of just an important part of the way we run in our cellar. So we eventually had to move away from Conan. But throughout that, we were experimenting a little bit with London 3. We weren't actually super thrilled on London 3 at first. I thought it was just like a little more subtle than Conan in terms of ester production. Didn't kick out as much fruit, but clearly we had to kind of experiment with that more, and that came later with London 3. But we got into this Sac Trois thing, and Matt, I'm sure you remember. We were talking a lot about that. That was 2017 and 2018, and that was a really cool yeast, and threw just all kinds of crazy, passion fruit and mango, and just this huge, fruit bowl of aroma that seemed to do some type of biotransformation. It almost got like crazier as it aged a little bit, but there was a lot of negative effects with the Sac Trois strain as well. It for one, it hyper attenuated, so it got really, really dry, which is kind of the opposite of what you want to do with these beers. You want to leave quite a bit of residual sugar behind to kind of balance that heavy hop load to get the aroma that you're going for. And also, it just was a real difficult yeast to keep around in the cellar. So eventually, out of necessity, I think we landed on London 3. And then through, a lot of experimentation with temperature and pitch rate, really, I think, we hold back when we pitch with London 3 to kind of drive those yeast esters and really get as much out of it as possible. So, figuring that out was, a couple years, and
Can I interject right there? I just want to clarify.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm just kind of, now you're bringing me back to like my old days here at the Brewing Network, where I was just learning a ton from you guys. So you're holding back a little on your yeast pitch. And if I remember right, it stresses out the yeast like just enough that they start putting out these flavors that you're looking for. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And not like grossly under pitching, yeast. I think, on our standard, hazy IPA, I think we shoot for 750,000 cells per milliliter per degree Plato. And that's kind of a happy medium up until about, 17, 18 Plato. And then we want to get it up to, just shy of 1. And that's worked well for us, but it's also taken a while to kind of figure that out. And there's little intricacies, involved with that as well in terms of keeping it viable and keeping it around. And, when the yeast will tend to flock out, you got to know when to kind of start with a new pitch. So, it's all just about learning and figuring out what works. But I think, what Neil was saying about, the construction of these beers and what you're going for, I think London's a really versatile strain that works well.
Okay. It's interesting too, because before the haze craze, West Coast IPAs, from a yeast perspective, went exactly the opposite of what you guys are describing, right? The cleanest yeast you could find is what people were going for. Cal Ale, super popular. There's some others being used, of course. Not a lot of esters, really just relying on flavors coming out of the hops when it came to like the florality of the beer. And so I think when people simplify hazy beer as like, oh yeah, it's just hazy. It's a hazy, it's hazy. It's an IPA that's hazy. It's such an understatement because you've really done an opposite type of fermentation than you so many brewers had perfected. Like that West Coast IPA, one of my favorite styles still. Y'all got so good at it. And then, oh, hey, let's just flip that upside down and not do that. Let's leave some sugar behind. Let's have all these esters. And how do we do that? And I'm guessing it was a challenge. Like you just said, it kind of took a couple years even before learning some of these things.
I was going to throw in there, and it was a little bit of a different twist for me in my journey, because I've always worked with British ale strains that were pretty big ester producers. So, when everyone talked about, oh, you want to find fruit forward yeast, you want to find a yeast that's doing all this biotransformation and all of that. And we did some GC profiling of what would happen when we fermented with this London 3 versus, the other British strain that we use. And we were finding our British strain was actually producing more ester and more fruity notes and more isoamyl, but it won't throw a haze. It just drops bright. Oh. And so, we were kind of coming at it from a couple different angles. We're like, man, if we could get our yeast to throw that kind of a haze, we probably could produce it with our house strain. But felt like, and now that I've gotten to know London 3 and derivatives of that yeast better, now I get it, how to manipulate a little bit more to produce a little bit more of what I call more of a juicy, fruity character than we could ever have done with that initial yeast. But boy, it took me a while to wrap my head around it. Yeah, and that's right, JC, because then you threw that like Sactois curveball at me, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to bring a diastaticus yeast into my brewery to make these beers.
I hope I didn't sabotage you with that.
Yeah, I was like, what? And then there was like mixed culture talk and all this. I'm like, man, this is getting tough.
So Matt, I'm drinking. I got sent your Elena. How do you guys pronounce it? What yeast is in this? Is this London?
Correct. London 3.
It is. Okay. Yeah.
Same yeast that we make Mind Haze and Double Mind.
That one. It's hazy.
With. And that's a beer that was formulated by Sam Tierney down at the Propagator. And that one's interesting in that it's actually just pale ale malt and about 30% malted oats fermented with London 3. And then it's all New Zealand hopped with Nelson and Rawaka. And it just turned out fabulous, man. And Sam goes back and forth in that brewery about whether to fine or not to fine, basically to drop yeast or not. I don't believe that beer that you just held up saw any fining. And, not to go too deep down the rabbit hole of beer geekery, but we like to drop the yeast out of them and we can still get a pretty nice hazy beer. And that's just kind of our program. We'll centrifuge here when we can. And we're having some difficulties with foam in some of our fined beers. So we backed off a little bit more recently, but yeah, that's a Sam creation. And then we're going to do a collaboration later this week where we go 50% with malted oats and pale, just real simple recipes, playing around with that ratio in the same yeast strain.
Okay. I want to come back to oats and different grain bill ingredients, because I think that goes back to what Neil was saying about how the mouthfeel of this style is so important. But before we leave just like yeast strains in particular, JC, I think the most recent contains no juice I got from you here, which would be like your 7th anniversary contains no juice. You developed a yeast with a local yeast maker to kind of get what you wanted out of it, didn't you? Didn't that have a very unique yeast in it?
Yeah, I don't think we were the ones that developed it. I think they were already, the guys at Berkeley Yeast were already, experimenting with how to, and we're going to go down the rabbit hole here, but how to accentuate thiols in the finished product through fermentation. Some thiols are just, very small sulfuric compounds that are measured in the parts per trillion that they have, little acronyms. There's 3MH and 3MHA and 4MMP. And, those are basically responsible for the flavor in a lot of fruit and wine and even in beer. And some hops have them naturally. And we're talking like grapefruit, passion fruit, guava, really kind of accurate descriptors for what I think a lot of brewers are going for with Hazy IPA. So we asked them to make basically a London 3 version of that strain that they've been working on. I believe was just like a neutral American ale strain. And we had been working on that in our little 5-barrel brewery here in Carmel, kind of dialing in dry hop rate and just basically seeing how it would work. And after about 3 or 4 trials, we just went for it with contains no juice, and it's pretty crazy result. It's if you've had like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc wine before, it's without any hops, and you just go through a normal fermentation, it smells just like it. It's passion fruit and gooseberry and lychee, and it's just crazy. So it's definitely a unique canvas to then rip a bunch of hops on top of and basically create this like flavor bomb, so on to speak. But it's very new to us, and we've only done, that was the first production batch that we've done with it, and it's something we're playing with. It's really exciting.
Excellent.
GMO.
It's GMO, yeah. It's genetically modified yeast, but I don't think it has the stigma associated with GMO. But yeah, it is a yeast that is genetically altered to biotransform thiols that are bound in grain mostly, but also in hops and other precursors. And that takes bound thiols and makes them free, and basically through an enzymatic process, translates to aroma and flavor.
Awesome.
I mean, wasn't all yeast like at some point in its career genetically modified to turn into brewer's yeast? So I think this is nothing new. Don't worry, folks. It's nothing new. You've been drinking this shit for a long time. You're going to be fine.
It's all mutants. It is all mutants.
It's all mutants. Yeah.
Domesticated mutants.
Yeah. So, all right. And then since we're still on yeast, I want to go back to something that Matt said. You've all talked about it, and that's yeast flocculation and where you want it to do that, and what impact that has on hazy beer. So maybe could we start with a clarification? And I kind of get different answers about this all the time. There are people who think that the haze, 100% of the haze in a hazy beer is yeast. And there are people that think all the haze in a hazy beer is hop material. And then I hear crazy things from Matt and others who say, oh no, we sometimes centrifuge our hazy beer. And then I'm going, well, how is there anything in that beer if you centrifuge it? So can you guys help me understand what makes a hazy beer hazy, and how yeast, and I guess hops too, affect that? Neil, you want to start?
Yeah, I think the haze has been our biggest kind of challenge with how to make it stable. We kind of battled that stigma at first because we didn't want to make beer just, to be turbid. That was never our intention. We wanted to make an IPA that presented with all these characteristics, and a byproduct was that was mostly hazy. But that was never the goal. That was never the intent. But at the same time, we did see that obviously, for one, the consumer has different, there's an aesthetic quality to the beer that has now just become synonymous with juice. So the higher the turbidity, sometimes, even if it's not as juicy or even as drinkable, it markets really well. It Instagrams really well. So those are some like tangible, actual challenges that we never wanted those to be considerations on the production side. But we did see that there were some changes in even mouthfeel. If a beer dropped extremely bright, we would see a little bit, even without any change in, attenuation's the same. So, we kind of liken that to the protein or and we kind of, I think a lot of folks were starting to look at polyphenol and protein binding and how that affects haze stability and not yeast. I think that was I think that was really the misconception for a very long time, was that, you just basically, you package green beer and you have hazy IPA. You package it a week earlier than normal, and you don't crash it. You just, you package it out of the fermenter at 60 degrees, and now you've got hazy IPA. And I think that was, a lot of people liken that to yeast. And that, not to say that people weren't rushing beer to package to accomplish this aesthetic goal, but our best batches are, ones that we have almost no yeast left, and we do centrifuge. We commissioned our centrifuge last year, and we're targeting, NTUs in the range of close to 1,200, sometimes even 1,500, which is crazy to run a centrifuge and still end up with a beer that hazy, that turbid. But our goal is not to, we're trying to drop yeast. We're trying to drop, vegetal hop matter. We're trying to make the beer as, as ready to enjoy as soon as we package it, rather than these longer conditioning times we had before this. So we were doing bright conditioning for a week or longer on some of our really excessively dry hop beers, and they would still have this really substantial hop burn for a very long time. So the centrifuge for us wasn't really to change the turbidity at all or the haze. It was to really focus on quality and freshness and be able to get the beer to where we have our extra juicy bits is the total hop load is close to 14 pounds per barrel, and it's just an excessively ridiculous beer. But the byproduct was that we had to condition it forever to make it even drinkable, because there's so much dry hop and hop burn. The centrifuge has really helped us, especially on those really excessively dry hop beers, just to make all the hop character pop without the associated kind of vegetal burn and all that. So
how the hell do you kids afford to do that?
Yeah.
Well, the centrifuge makes it a little more affordable. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
$20.
That's crazy talk. 14 pounds.
I know. We just did we did an extra for our 6th anniversary back a few months ago, and that one was the most we've done, and it was really fun to do. I don't know if we'll ever do it again, just because losses, when you start to package about half the beer you put in the you knocked out of the kettle in the whirlpool, it's like maybe we hit that threshold. But yeah, the centrifuge does help us recover a lot of that.
Make some happy hop farmers out there.
Yeah,
I think that JC and Neil are too young for this, Matt, like in their brewing careers. But Matt, you remember the hop crisis? Remember when they
remember the hop crisis? Let me tell you about the hop. No, I'm just kidding.
See, and I feel like brewers like you and me we're like people who survived the Great Depression. Like 25 cents for milk? Are you insane? And so when Neil says something like 14 barrels, we're like, this person is crazy. We would never.
That's downright scandalous.
Yeah. Oh, hop crisis. Good Lord. Now the hop crisis is the consumers. They don't have enough of it in their mouths. Okay.
But I'm glad, Neil, that you brought that up, because, for us, the challenge was producing a beer that would have the kind of shelf life that our other beers have. The challenge was 120 days of shelf stability. And when we first got into this, all we kept hearing from everybody we were talking to was like, ooh, these beers are beautiful, fresh and young, but they really tend to fall apart pretty quickly. And that's what kind of kept me up at night. So, we deployed the centrifuge thinking that, the hop burn was part of it, but I think more specifically, I was focused on removing yeast, thinking that autolyzed yeast and whatever would happen to that yeast once we packaged, especially in such a hop driven solution, would just shorten our shelf life. And but I think it's interesting you're talking about the hop burn as well. I think it does work to clean a little bit of that up, especially when you start getting, in this brewery, it's like when we're north of 3 or 4 pounds per barrel, not 14 pounds per barrel, but in relative,
a few times a year.
That's awesome.
Now, freshness aside, and all IPAs, hazies included, should be drank soon, and you're talking about shelf stability. But theoretically, if I bought Juicy Bits and I lagered it in my fridge long enough, right there in that can, would it drop clear?
Since we commissioned the centrifuge, we've done some extended trials at cold, and it really maintains a very uniform haze stability. And I think that is pointing to what Matt alluded to, is the yeast. That final, just dropping the last bit of that yeast, the yeast is gonna drop. That's the inevitable part. So whatever's left in the package will eventually flock and fall out. What I think is happening, and we haven't done enough data or trials to prove this, but I think as that yeast, whatever's residual in the can at package, whatever's left at flocks, whether it's 30 or 60 days in your fridge, you forgot about it, it's going to drop protein and other, and polyphenols, all the other components of that haze. Some of that's going to drop as well. So we found the lower our cell counts are in package, post centrifuge, the lower the cell count, the less yeast we have left, the better haze stability we see. So
I see. Wow.
I think that's another benefit to, like Matt said, just I don't think any of us, there's really not a ton of benefit for yeast. Now, obviously, it's some of it is tolerable at lower thresholds. It's not going to turn the beer into dust in 30 days, but anything that's exceeding, a few, even 1,000 cells per mil is going to, I think we're going to see, especially in package, that beer will drop bright. It'll change, flavor wise. It won't hold up as well. So I think even 90-day juicy bits in your fridge kept cold will probably look very similar to the same haze that you poured at package.
Wow. Okay. JC, same kind of line of questioning for you. Are you guys using a centrifuge? Are you doing anything like that with your hazies?
Oh yeah, we're on Team Centrifuge, and just to kind of piggyback on what Neil was saying, like we basically found that if you don't pull a lot of your yeast out, it's going to bind to those polyphenols and even your hop compounds. Like if you even like taste yeast off a tank that's been dry hopped, I mean, it's super, super bitter. So for us, we kind of changed the way we dry hop. We actually will soft crash our tanks to a temperature to try and get as much yeast out of the tank as possible before we dry hop. And then absolutely, we run it through a centrifuge to pull all that yeast out, because that will, if we don't, bring that out, it will drop bright in the can and pull everything else along with it down. And then it's just, you're kind of not really having a hazy IPA at that point. So that was through a lot of trial and error. And the centrifuge is just like a part of your recipe.
Okay.
And I think it can actually improve the quality of the beer and make it a lot smoother by removing that harsh, stringent, kind of hop burn that's associated with these higher levels. But you can pull too much haze out, and we've kind of struggled a little bit as we've commissioned ours over the last year and a half. Unfortunately, today's consumer likes to judge a book by its cover, and if it's not really hazy, it's going to be kind of automatically sort of set aside or preemptively judged. I hate to say it, but it's a little bit true. So like Neil said, we're shooting for certain EBC NTU targets on our centrifuge, which can be difficult, and it really comes down to recipe formulation and really getting as much of the yeast out as possible, actually, before it really gets run through the centrifuge.
As long as we're on that subject, in this brewery, we don't have a lot of levers to pull in that regard. So in general, when we're running a hazy beer, we're basically running, fast as we can, lowest bowl speed possible. And, we do want to see yeast removal, but we want to see maximum haze otherwise. Is that a similar strategy for you guys?
Definitely.
Yeah. We're not as concerned about the actual turbidity. We're really just concerned about yeast. So whatever, and it obviously, we have the turbidity both in and out, but it'd be great to measure cell counts in those as well. I think that would for us be a better, we want to maintain some haze, but it's not the target. It's dropping yeast, and beyond that, anything else that drops when you're dropping that much yeast, I think is non-desirable. It's nothing you want to keep around. It's our bigger kind of vegetal hop care, all those things that add mostly just off flavors, nothing that's positive.
Okay.
So I have to go back to something JC said, because, maybe a little contrary to what some people think. We talked about biotransformation. That obviously involves having yeast, active yeast, in the presence of hops, but you were talking about a soft crash to remove yeast before you add the hops. Is there some combination, or is there this program of some addition early on to get some biotransformation positives, and then more later on after the yeast has been removed? And is that also, I'm going to ask, some type of a strategy in avoiding hop creep?
Yeah, well, definitely the hop creep for sure. That's one way we've been able to get around it, is short, I guess we'll start with that, but short contact time and a cooler temperature, and just recirculating the hops to get as much saturation as possible is it was born out of minimizing hop creep, that strategy. But then we kind of found that we were actually getting a lot of yeast out and getting a higher turbidity without a lot of yeast through the centrifuge. Yeah, a lot of it has to do with like hop variety too, because some of these hops are just have way more polyphenols than, you know, other hops. And, you know, like, for example, like we've been messing around with Waimea, 2020 Waimea from Freestyle. And, you know, we did like a pound per barrel in it. And the thing looks just like crazy. It looks like a bomb went off. It's like unreal. And so I think that's like something that's been fun to learn. And, you know, obviously every hop variety is completely different in terms of, you know, its aromatic and flavor potential, but it's just kind of interesting how some hops can contribute more haze than others. It's been interesting.
Would you say some hops turn your beer into a hop grenade, JC?
No, not our beer, because we're getting that yeast out. So we're
good, because I would sue you in a second if you said that your beers were hop grenades.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, got it.
Okay, I want to relate this discussion about the results you're getting from yeast, how haze works. A lot of these comments you're making about that hop bite, yeast bite, anything left. I want to relate it back to the consumer a little bit and how it has to do with why hazy IPAs have become so popular and why we love them so much. And if we were to tie everything y'all just said together about how you're doing it, I think consumers would really understand why and why that beer tastes the way it does. And I thought maybe I'd start with just kind of anecdotally. I think that Hazy IPA has turned on a lot of new beer drinkers who didn't like beer before. And they didn't like beer because they didn't like bitterness. And even if they drank beer, they would never have touched an IPA. They had one IPA a long time ago and it was too bitter and they never went back until somebody handed them a hazy IPA. And that soft bitterness and the mouthfeel that we still need to talk about too, I think really opened up a whole new palate for people. So when you guys are discussing the science of this fermentation, it's all can be very complex on your side, but on my side, on your consumer side, what's wonderful about it is that it just provides this very drinkable beer that still tastes like beer without all that bitterness. And now I can be a hophead and still not love bitterness, right? Or at least firm bitterness. So that's kind of one of my takes on how this style became so popular. The other is just straight up showcasing yeast, right? Like people just love, showcasing hops, because people just love hop varieties now. They know them by name. We talked about this on the last podcast. Like, hop varieties are famous now. Mosaic. I love Mosaic. I'm a big fan. It's like such a weird, Mosaic's like a band. But all of those things, like I said, combine to make the style what it is. And so maybe we can let's talk about mouthfeel a little bit. And we've talked a little bit about how yeast, I think, contributes to that. We've mentioned how you're pulling yeast out because it's not something we want. That could disrupt your mouthfeel, I think, by adding some bitterness. What else are you doing to make that kind of pillowy, soft bed for the 14 pounds per barrel of hops that are going in? And JC, why don't we start with you this time? What do you tell me about some of your malt bills or what you're doing? It doesn't just have to be malt you're doing to make that background.
No, it totally has to do, with malt is definitely one of the parts. So we will, so our London 3 yeast is not the most attenuative of yeast. So, on a higher gravity, like a double IPA, we can still mash, relatively low and get it not to dry out beyond a certain spec. So I think leaving a lot of residual sugar behind is part of it. But in terms of like the grist, it's kind of, I think most brewers will answer that it's, a combination of high protein adjuncts, oats, wheat, flaked barley for some. We use a hard red wheat from Oregon that we have it custom kilned for us, so it's keep that color light, but the protein content is in excess of 16%, around 16%, which is just a great base for hop polyphenols to bind to create the stable haze. But it also lends a really nice, rich mouthfeel.
Can you give me a comparison just so I can understand if that wheat for you is like 16% protein, what would like what would an American 2-row be? Like, your clear IPA malt?
Probably like 11%. I don't know, Matt would probably know.
Okay. Pretty significant.
Yeah, I mean,
difference.
you're talking 10-11% is considered like good brewing standard malt.
Okay.
and typically lower is better by at least, Pilsner brewing standards and things like that. I mean, you can get into the weeds regarding foam positive and non-foam positive proteins, and you can also get, even deeper in the weeds on what provides FAN or free amino nitrogen for the yeast. But at the end of the day, typically brewers have shied away from high protein malts. And what's interesting is my time in Belgium, I learned that brewers are leaning back towards higher protein malts because it's so good for foam, even when you're making clear beers.
Okay.
So I think you're onto something there. And I just wanted to ask, is that just a toasted red wheat? It's not a malted wheat?
It's a hard red wheat. I think it's a spring variety. It's through Mecca grade when they're in kind of the near the Deschutes River there in Central Oregon. We've been using their malt for a little while. It's a really great product.
Oh, so it is a malted wheat. It's not just.
It's a malted wheat. Yeah. Yeah. It's a malted wheat. It's not flaked or gelatinized or anything like that. We love it. We actually use it in our West Coast IPAs, like you said, Matt, just for foam at about 10% of the grist, and it'll drop right.
Got it.
But yeah, it's a great product. I think, the water's big too. Obviously, for us, we use RO to start with, and we add back salts to get the desired outcome. And I think at this point I have like 5 versions of our hazy water bill, and we're always trying to learn more about that. It's something that's kind of hard to quantify sometimes, but in general, we try and keep our chloride levels higher than our sulfate. We try and keep a good amount of calcium in the water. So, I mean, that part's a little more tricky, but it's something that definitely has an impact.
Okay. See, and I hadn't thought about that, but I've always talked about water on this show in terms of like hop expressiveness. But I don't know that I've talked about, it contributing to mouthfeel, but I guess it's kind of the same thing. How it's going to interact with those hops is also going to contribute to your mouthfeel and yeast, everything. Okay. Is that something, Matt, did you guys have to make some major water adjustments when you got into hazy beer too?
Yeah, I mean, in general, we were already kind of following what everybody else has been preaching in terms of, beers that we want to have a softer mouthfeel. We use more, calcium chloride to adjust calcium. And I've long been in the camp of less is more in terms of water and the amount of salts I use. So I tend to be a little lean and mean, and I do start with RO water. So, back in my brewing school days, all the teachers always preach like the softer and cleaner the water was, the better the beer was going to be. And we did a lot of experiments where we just brewed with RO and no salts, and we're able to make some pretty rad beers. So
oh wow,
I tend to be pretty minimal, like just enough calcium to get the job done on most of our beers. But yeah, I mean, long and the short of it is we use more calcium chloride on the hazy beers. But yeah, I'm not the expert. I'm just using old man tricks on these beers, trying to keep up with these guys.
Old man, remember it's just
the hop crisis.
You remember we're gonna have to do it once a show, Matt. You and I are gonna have to go. Do you remember? Just anything.
But Neil, I'm curious because I know you spend a lot of time thinking about those things too. How do you approach that, both the malt side and the salt side of things?
Yeah, water chemistry was a big part of our kind of research and just some trials, and where we landed was almost 3-to-1 now, chloride to sulfate. Our sulfate we're trying to keep around 70 to 90, so under 100, and then we're pushing chloride close to 250, some a little bit higher. I'd say that's definitely on the higher end for chloride, and for us it was really just about that accentuation of mouthfeel. And we don't want, like I said, malt should never be the focus, but we do want to bring in some of that malt character as we get these really heavily dry hopped and hop beers. So we kind of lean on a malt backbone at times to balance those beers out. So chloride was a big part of that. The challenges we faced when we were building these really big kind of water adjustments were calcium in particular was getting too high. So we were triggering really early flock, and it was flocking hard because our calcium was exceeding 150, 160 parts. And that's mainly a byproduct of using both calcium chloride and calcium sulfate for our salt addition. So we basically switched the sulfates to magnesium sulfate, so Epsom, and that helped us keep that calcium in check. That was a really, a few years, maybe 2 years into a year and a half, we made that switch, and that helped us keep the calcium levels, under 150, closer to 120 or just over 100. And that really helped us with haze stability and consistency. Even harvests were improved for second gens and all that. So that was a small tip that we picked up that was, we were always using way too much just calcium in general between the two salt additions, and switching our sulfate from calcium sulfate over to magnesium sulfate. Obviously, you don't want too much magnesium, so I wouldn't switch both, but even just the small amount of sulfate we were trying to drive in that 75 part range was still well under the threshold where we worry about anyone getting the shits from too much magnesium, which I think is always it's always the big fear. Everyone's like, test your water, make sure you don't have too much magnesium. It's like, what happens? Like, it's just,
I'll tell you, it's an easy test.
Yeah, for sure. So,
no, but I think you nailed it. I mean, I think most of our water chemistry decisions were more about yeast health. Obviously, we're tasting the beer and there's a certain mouthfeel and there's an effect, but we're also really trying to, do what we need to do for the yeast. And most of our calcium, was all about yeast health, yeast flocculation, all the things. You just nailed it. That's, good advice. It
was something we never really even considered. We, obviously want enough calcium for yeast health, but too much can even be adverse. And that's something we didn't, anecdotally we started to see, and just made those substitutions. But I mean, as far as, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then counterintuitive to all of that is like when you get too low in calcium, yeast tends to produce oxalate downstream, and you have gushers and other issues. And, a lot of brewers haven't experienced that or haven't gotten there. But, if you ever see those little shiny diamonds when you're counting yeast on your hemocytometer, you probably need to go back to the calcium calculator and make sure you're where you need to be.
Yeah. And even, any generational changes obviously get exacerbated as you keep going down down to third or fourth generations if you're pushing these yeast that far. So we just started to see those kind of impacts that by the time we get to the second, especially with too much calcium, we would see really, really poor second gen harvest. So, but for malt, our base was, has always really been 50-50 split for base malts between both Pilsner and our pale malt. And that was just to give us, we still wanted, it was hard to get the kind of, the baseline malt character we wanted from just one of those two. Is either too light or too dark, and color was such an important part, especially as you're making turbid beer. Those kinds of color decisions, in a normal beer would never even be a consideration, but you get too dark and you start to, see turbidity rise, and it's not appealing anymore. You get too light and the same thing happens. So you're trying to, like I said, we're never going to make Instagram decisions on production, but there's some tangible benefits too, I think, with just lightening some of our base malts. So that led us to, okay, what's our protein? How do we build up that protein, a high protein malt base? And we've kind of really loved a mix of both oats and wheat, and not just flaked wheat, but also white wheat too. So we use our malted white wheat we really love, but not exclusive. We also love the flaked wheat, and we also love flaked oats too. So we trialed a bunch of different high protein malts, and that's kind of the three that we use in the range of 20 to 25% of the malt bill. We've gone higher and seen, some really great results, but for a consistent mash bill for us, it's kind of that 25%, almost evenly split between white wheat, and flaked oats has kind of really produced the best results for us.
Wow. I don't know, JC. I think Neil just gave you your next beer name. Instagram Decisions is a pretty good beer name. You know what I'm saying?
Brew for the gram.
Brew for the gram.
That's funny.
But you touched on color, and maybe both of you guys can let us know. I mean, is there a number for these hazy beers that you're trying not to exceed, where it starts to look a little too dark? And is there such a thing as too light a hazy beer? It's like I talk with Evan down at Green Cheek, and it's like he's using brewer's crystals and doing all sorts of things to even make it lighter and look like, flour suspended in water sometimes. I mean, where's the sweet spot?
I think we've seen too light doesn't seem to be an issue very often, especially if you can maintain some haze and turbidity. It doesn't seem like you ever have too ill effect from too light. I think more for me, it's the flavor and the backbone. Some of that, that base that you want to support all these hops gets a little bit overwhelmed if you don't have, something behind it. And it doesn't need to be something dark, not crystal or anything, but just something to still give you some, some malt character behind that. But too dark, we're trying to keep ours in the four and under kind of SRM. And even 5 is fine. I think it just depends on, for us, a turbidity. Honestly, NTUs will really play into that. So if we're consistently hitting a much higher NTU than even 1,000, then we will want to lighten it up, because those beers just become darker as you have more opacity. And so, if you're shooting for 1,000 NTUs for turbidity, I would say that you wouldn't want to be over 4. If you're kind of more comfortable in the 500 to 600 range for NTUs for turbidity, I'd say you could get away with a little bit higher than that. But that's kind of the rule of thumb we've used. And it's almost, by the time you get to those decisions, it's too late. The beer's already, it is what it is. So it might be one that you encourage to drink out of the can, which I think is a brilliant philosophy employed by a lot of other people in that. So we don't want to make beer for aesthetic purposes, but I think we all know that those do have, and we also see some outcomes in the actual, the way the beer presents, not just aesthetically, but the way it drinks. There are some differences there too.
So JC, is there a minimum amount of hop needed to obtain the what did you call it? Opalescence, the turbidity.
Opacity?
Yeah, the opacity. Sorry.
I think it was opalescence, actually. I like it better.
I like that one a lot better.
Yeah.
I think Neil summed it up perfectly. I mean, I think we shoot for really pale beers for the Hazy IPA. Yeah, I think what he said is exactly where, in the same camp. But I do think that, traditionally, I mean, you look at beers like, Treehouse, like the pioneers of the style, they're, quite a bit darker, and, they're received very well, obviously. I don't know. It's interesting right now. The craze seems to be on really pale, and, we'll see, where that goes, obviously. But
Okay. Oh, how about the question of minimum, pounds per barrel, however you grams?
Oh yeah, sure.
To really impact that haze as you'd like to see it. I mean, obviously it's all about flavor and everything like that, but I'm always trying to draw this line between this visual and then,
Sure.
hop impact you're looking for.
Yeah, I think to get that nice stable haze, depending on your, the varieties that you're using or your hops, we're usually like minimum 4 pounds per barrel, 4 to 5 pounds on our kind of single IPAs. Pale ales, if it's like a hazy pale ale, which we don't do a lot of hazy pale ales, but maybe a little bit less than that. And then double IPA, we're looking at generally 6 to 8. Over the last year, we got really into pushing the 8 pounds per barrel, between 8 and 9 mark, and we were using some cryo with that. And I counted cryo as like double the hop just for budgetary purposes, just so I didn't, lose money on the batch. But that was pretty cool. The oil factor and just the resin and intensity, I really liked it at that rate, but economically, it's a little more challenging. We're not going to shy away from that, but I might make those batch sizes a little bit smaller when we're getting that high.
It's already expensive to make the beers you guys are making. It's for everybody. And I think that consumers have an understanding of that, because they're paying these higher prices, right? But yeah, I'm glad that you just bring that up, even in the sense that to give the consumer what they want is costing a lot of money also on the brewery end. This is not a Budweiser problem. This is everybody's favorite local brewery problem. Like, okay, I'm going to give you what you want. You're going to have to pay for that.
Yeah, we have to brew a lot of other beers to be able to make our hazy beers. It's kind of like at a restaurant. It's like your French fries and your
right.
It's the high market item. That's not Hazy IPA, that's for sure.
Well, we've made it this far with only the word being mentioned once or twice, but the professional brewers who are listening to this podcast would hate me if I don't make us focus a little bit on biotransformation. And hopefully we don't have to dive into the entire world of that, because we don't have enough time. But let me give you my layman's terms of what I think you mean by it, and then you guys can either correct me and or move forward with what you think is happening and how you get that. But my understanding, and I've just started to learn about this over the last couple of years, is actually that the fermentation process, the yeast itself, and how it's working with all of the ingredients, but especially hops, there are biotransformations that occur that result in flavor change. They result in differences in fermentation. They result in all kinds of mostly beneficial things. I'm sure some of them you have to work on too. Am I on the right track here that that's a basic understanding of biotransformation, that compounds are being changed during the fermentation process? Good enough for the layman?
I would agree with that. I would agree.
Okay. So manipulating this process has become kind of like a tool for you guys, right? Like some of your favorite ways that hazy beers are expressing themselves is when you're finding that biotransformation is happening. Is that about right? And so with that, just talk to me about it. Are you choosing hops based on what you've discovered gets biotransformed? Are you manipulating your yeast based on what you've discovered it does to biotransform? I'm very novice at this, so that's about the best I can do to guide us down that path.
I'm going to take over and ask Matt a question about this.
Okay.
Because I think, Matt, if I for Union Jack, I think in particular, I remember you talking about your guys' hop additions and schedule, and it was pretty, obviously that's, when was Union Jack brought to market?
Oh my gosh, like 2006.
Okay. Yeah, that's, and I think that's, well, I think that's, I think at the time, not as even today, I think you guys had a very different approach to even those dry hop scheduling. So did you guys see, based on, all of it terminal, not terminal, were you guys already experimenting with that before any of us even were talking about biotransformation?
I mean, there had been some talk and there wasn't as much, scientific, base on all of it. A lot of it was anecdotal, but there was some science behind it. I mean, yeah, we believe that we wanted to get some, roughly half of the hops in during fermentation and the other half after, to try to take advantage of, biotransformation. I also in those days was chasing down oxygen control. So the earlier those hops went in, the better off we were. And that became a little bit of a program on the West Coast side. And that's carried forward on our hazy program as well. Not with every beer we produce, but I do like to get some hops in early. And I'm really curious what you guys feel about that, because there's pluses and minuses. I mean, obviously, you start dry hopping in the middle of fermentation, you can't harvest that yeast, so you're sacrificing, that. There could be other issues of too vigorous of fermentation. You end up scrubbing off a lot of the good stuff you're trying to get in there. And my experience as well, which is always something I'm trying to figure out, and I don't know that I've necessarily cracked this nut, is sulfur control with London 3 and making sure that, you're not promoting some of that mercaptan like sulfur edgy stuff that can happen with that yeast. And I think it does have something to do with hops. So yeah, I'll turn it over to you from there. I mean,
well, I think that's what we were originally kind of going after, was not necessarily biotransformation for those early mid fermentation additions. It was more what you mentioned, the oxygen, trying to really capitalize on a oxygen deprivant, environment without any sort of consideration for exactly how it was different from a biotransformation perspective. So our very first batches of Juicy Bits, we were doing almost halfway through fermentation. We even trialed some stuff at knockout from the fermenter, or from the whirlpool into the fermenter, adding some hops then, which, there's still some fun experiments to do, but we found that we also, for any hops we added there, we lost all the aromatics, because there's such, so it's diminished gains. Now we're obviously, at 14 pounds per barrel, we're not always just concerned about efficiency, but we can't just throw caution to the wind and just start burning hops for no good reason. So we always want to find out what actually has proven and consistent results that actually improves the quality of the beer. So we've kind of shied away from our active fermentation additions for dry hopping in most of our, especially Juicy Bits, because I think for the benefits of potential, lower oxygen, which we still get some because we're doing it towards the tail end of fermentation, not quite midway, but still, still some active fermentation. But the earlier we were adding them, the more we volatilize all those aromatics. And so it became which scale are you tipping? And, obviously, like you said, there's also some tangible, you can't harvest that yeast if you exceed a certain threshold. And so for a brewery that's now made our flagship out of, London Ale 3 is now our house yeast, those considerations are very real. It's not just every batch is, this is the end of the line for the yeast. Some of those, we can't make those decisions. But we also did see that we were almost, I think, creating for whatever, and I think biotransformation is something I'm super curious to see what we actually learn in the next 5 years. I think it's probably something we will be dedicating a lot more resources towards understanding. It feels a lot like hop creep, as far as just these almost industry moving revelations about the way that we did things. We saw anecdotally what the results were. We just don't know why. Yeah. I'm excited to get more of the why, but we started to see diminished returns on some of those, early decisions on designing recipes in New England IPAs. We are more committed now to closer to terminal because we maintain a little bit more of the aromatic quality, which is for us the hardest to really push. And even at 6-8 pounds per barrel, 10, if we're, some of our doubles are pushing 10, obviously extra is the only one that's beyond that. But even just juicy bits at, around 5 pounds or more, that one we did tons of trials figuring out when to schedule dry hops, how long to extend them, how we split the loads. And we've just kind of found that the less we kind of architect those schedules and the simpler we can do it with a little bit less kind of volatile fermentation going on, the better we've seen the results. So what we started as really championing this mid fermentation addition, we've backed off entirely. So I think we still do those trials, and a few one-offs will do that. And it produces a different beer, but I can't say definitively it produces a better beer or something that actually, supports the, how much you lose in aromatics.
How about you, JC?
So we experimented. Well, first of all, I'm sure you guys have both dry hopped a tank during fermentation. It's very dangerous and messy. And I've had a volcano on myself, which is not fun at all. So we've always been like nervous to do that, but this whole theory of biotransformation, we had to put it to the test. And we found that on our hazy beers, in order to minimize hop creep and do that kind of soft crash to our tank, which I dodged your question earlier on that, Matt. We're not doing any biotransformation with our hazy beers right now. What we are doing with biotransformation is on our West Coast beers. We're seeing a lot of success with actually not on a partial to full dry hop load, kind of debunking the myth, at least in my experience, my anecdotal experience, that you blow off a lot of that flavor during fermentation. And that's where West Coast IPA right now is really fun for us, because we're having, experimenting with different enzymes like the glucosidase enzyme that will sort of take a yeast that's not necessarily naturally going to, biotransform, monoterpenes. It's going to give that added enzymatic push to get those processes done and actually create some really fruity, interesting aroma, profiles. But I mean, we don't dry hop the way we used to, so we're not getting showered anymore. Thank you for that, Matt, because we took your hop cannon idea, which has been just awesome for us.
Yeah, and that eliminates the oxygen concern. Back to that whole point. It gives you a lot more flexibility in that regard.
Definitely. I think we actually noticed on a couple beers that we dry hopped early into fermentation that it actually would bind to the yeast and would actually, like, those beers were a lot more clear that we noticed. And it actually kind of facilitates West Coast IPA. It actually kind of works on brightening your beer without using any biofine or anything. We've kind of noticed, at least with, just kind of like a neutral ale strain. So
I love hearing that you're experimenting with West Coast IPA. It's like your new, it's the circle of life. I think it's
totally full circle,
yeah,
100%.
that would be I mean, like for our experimental like playground, it would be West Coast IPA because we're now known for what we do with Hazy IPA in New England. So if we want to do something totally different, it's got to be West Coast, which is it's the full circle.
It's so
exactly
funny. I love hearing it too. So I don't drink all of the beers we get from you that come through here, JC, because I don't ride jet skis enough and stuff. But
I've only been on one once in my whole life, for the record.
Yeah, but I do try to drink every single West Coast that you send through here. And yeah, you are killing it. I'm curious about one, even though this is a hazy show. I really love. I think it's called Triple Cone, green can, Triple Cone.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. And when people
Thanks,
are going
man.
through asking for West Coast, I always go, oh, Alvarado doesn't just make hazy and fruity things. You should try Triple Cone. Is that beer an example of what you're talking about? Like where you're experimenting with things, or has that one been around too long?
That one's been around since we opened. That's like kind of our, homage to Pliny the Younger. It's a, triple West Coast IPA, beer that is brewed kind of once a year. This year we did do, I believe like a 3.5 pound per barrel knockout edition with employing with an enzyme and then we, double dry hopped it on top of that and all that kind of stuff. So it's just been fun to try different things and
yeah
to figure it all out still.
Well, that's why I still have a career, because you guys are still figuring shit out that I get to talk about. So
well, it's beers like Union Jack that is why we have careers, honestly. I mean, like
yeah,
beer like it was yesterday, 100%.
Yeah. Do you mean Union Jack that came out during the hop crisis? I think that's the beer you're talking about. I think it was right then that Matt had to go to.
It was our big fat middle finger to the hop crisis. There you go.
Was it Simcoe Amarillo Centennial, Matt, in that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it was like all of 2 pounds per barrel originally.
It was amazing.
All of 2 pounds per barrel. Yeah.
Do you even consider that a dry hop, or is that just like?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, they're like, no, what are you doing? All right. Well, another topic that we could go on forever, but we're just about out of time. Unless Matt, there's anything that you really wanted to squeeze in there.
I had a whole nother page of questions, but we'll have to pick it up some other time.
Yeah, we'll do part 2. It's no problem. I did come away with a lot of info on hazy from you guys, but honestly, the overarching thing that I think I got from this is that hazy beer is not the lazy brewer's beer, which is something I think was that misnomer in the beginning. I almost feel like I have to make fun of JC a little less because he's doing really complex things over there making the hazy beers, and I don't like that. I enjoy making fun of you.
Keep it up.
But it sounds like it's the nuances that you guys are discussing to get these beers to taste like they should, because we've all had a bad hazy beer, and you might have even brewed your own bad hazy beer. So to really get to where you want it, like these nuances it's a very difficult style. You guys have really put yourselves to the test, I guess is what I'm saying. It's good on you. I don't know why I'm so lazy. I never would have done that, but good on you guys.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll get us out of here. I did want to ask, I couldn't see the can, Matt, but what Alvarado Street were you drinking?
So it's the DeLorean Dust.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And I picked this up from the brewery. It's amazing. It's insane. This is a cryo beer though, right?
There's some cryo in it, yeah. I think that one's around 8 pounds per barrel with some Mosaic cryo, and I think there's some Idaho 7, maybe some Idaho 7 cryo in there as well. I'm glad.
That was going to be one of my questions. Was going to be a rundown, and maybe you can just do it really quick. Rundown of just like some of your top favorite hops for this style.
Yeah.
Yeah, hell yeah. The New Zealand stuff. I mean, Matt, you mentioned that beer you did at the Propagator, Nelson Rawaka. That's been like my favorite combo of 2020, 2021. I mean, those hot. I mean, I've always loved Nelson. Rawaka is an insane hop. I'm absolutely loving that. So shout out to the New Zealand hop growers down there. They're doing a great job. I really like Well, I don't. We haven't really used it in a lot of hazy beers, but that HBC 586 is pretty cool. Been digging that a lot. What do you think, Neil?
We really fell in love with Lotus and Sabro about 2 years ago. Those two in particular, we started incorporating them into a new brand that it's called Advanced Fluid Dynamics. So Juicy Bits, Citra Mosaic Alvarado, and those are hard to beat. I mean, it's a great combo. So we love that, but it got to a point where we were relying on those, two of those three or all three of those almost in every, like there was some iteration of that kind of flavor profile in everything we made. And so Advanced Fluid Dynamics was this very intentional, especially Sabro, kind of with this coconut, almost, I liken it more to like oak lactones, these characteristics that you would not expect in hops. And it's not even just straight fruit. It's more, this almost oily, fatty kind of like flavor that we don't get in other hop varietals. And then with Lotus, it was this kind of, orange creamsicle character that we also had never seen before. So we started playing with those two together, and we got this really fun combo that we grounded with Citra this year. We kind of revamped that recipe. So it's Citra, Sabro, Lotus, and that's been a really fun beer just to kind of riff on, especially with the New Zealand hops. We did Tahiki just recently, Motueka, and we've really enjoyed kind of using that as a little bit of a playground. Just, we've obviously gone through the gamut with Juicy Bits and all the different DDH varietals, and not that we're going to stop doing that, but at some point, I think everybody, even when I think we're almost at batch 700 of Juicy Bits, which is crazy because we're just, never built it as a flagship brand. But you kind of get to that point where you're like, it so well that it almost feels like even when you experiment within that profile, it doesn't feel different. Whereas Advanced Fluid Dynamics definitely was kind of more of this, it's kind of our next iteration of what we think hops are new for 2020, 2021. And so that's been a really fun one. But yeah, the New Zealand, Motueka, Rawaka, there's been a lot of really fun ones. And I'm really excited about some of the experimental varietals and even some of the new, like Phantasm and some other kind of new products. It's a really fun time to be making IPA. I think for home brewers and pro brewers alike, there is so much more research right now and like you mentioned, even enzymes. I think, talking about kind of some next foray into unlocking more flavors than any of us have really tried to yet. I think it's just the beginning. I think we're going to see some really fun experimentation happen in the next, 5 to 10 years as we start to understand more about, improvements to hop technology. And even I think the hop creep is all a product of us just getting, the hop industry is improving their processing. I think that's the only reason hop creep exists. It's not like those enzymes weren't, prevalent before. They were just not surviving the whole processing part of it. It was, but now I think that's the biggest factor is those enzymes are, were basically during the kiln process and whatever else was happening during processing, they couldn't survive. And now we're just, we're seeing from the entire industry, all the supply chain, their processing, pelletizing, all of that has gotten so much better that now we have this new problem of hop creep. Like, hey, here's an enzyme that we never thought, we never had issues with because the enzymes just died. And it's what a fun time to be making beer when technology is so good. It introduces new problems for brewers that didn't exist, even 15 years ago. So I'm as excited about new products and new uses of hops as I am about new varietals, because I think we all get kind of, there's so many fun new varietals, but what is the same varietal process in different ways going to look like? And what is Citra in 2025 going to look like? What was it? Cryo? Is it, is there Phantasm, or what are we looking at then? And it does feel like the new front. It feels like there's nothing but kind of experimentation on the table.
Just scratching the surface. Hang on, I got to make a note. Invite Neil back for Hop Creep show. Have you covered that? I don't know if you caught that, Matt.
Like it'll be our Halloween edition.
Yeah. Exactly. I have to ask about a hop you guys didn't mention. I was a little surprised no one threw out Idaho 7. That one seems to be like popular hoppy beer hop right now. Is that you guys are using that a little bit, right? Somewhere?
I absolutely love Idaho 7, and the other couple I was gonna throw out there, Cashmere and Azaka seem to fit really well into hazy beer. Cashmere being a public cultivar, Azacca coming out of a different breeding program than the HBC stuff. So one of the challenges when we got started on our hazy programs, everybody said, oh yeah, you got to use Mosaic and Citra. So we tried as hard as we could to omit them from the recipe and try to find other hops to work in there. With some success, but
with
mentioned,
success.
the Cool Kid hops and Strata is another one. I think if that wasn't mentioned, is another fun hop that plays well.
Definitely. Strata, for sure.
Yeah.
And the list goes on and on.
Yeah. I think it's fun to see beer, like hops that you don't expect in hazy IPA. And then like we did some really fun Columbus hazy IPAs that we all just were totally perplexed at how we got those kinds of characteristics out of Columbus. But it was, when you stop using them hot side and exclusively in dry hop, you get such a different expression. So that's always, I love being surprised by even some like more, I guess, throwback or classic, C's, the classic C's, and seeing how they incorporate in some regard to hazy IPA. And I think that's the best part of all this is like, there's not a right answer. There's definitely some that we all know will do well, but it doesn't mean there's not other answers that could even do better. And I think for us as a new brewery trying to carve our way into 2015 and 2016 with, that wasn't the hop crisis, but there was definitely a lot. It was, Citra was impossible for us to get in 2015 on contract to open. And so finding its spot was just, we were at the mercy of the spot market. And so it was like one day you might be able to brew an IPA with Citra and the other, a month later not. So that was when we designed Juicy Bits. Once we finally got the contract, that was opened Citra back up to us. But Eldorado was really initially for us was a driver because we couldn't find anything else. And it was almost by default. And then we fell in love with it. And for the last 2 crop years, it's our preferred hop of the 3, just with our selection. It's been the home run. And it's, maybe it's not a very well kept secret anymore, but those kinds of hops that you stumble upon either by, either because of, other external factors or just you fall in love with it from someone else's beer. That's a lot of fun of, that's half the fun of making these really unique IPAs.
Yep. Excellent. Well, gentlemen, for various reasons, I got to wrap up this podcast and invite you guys back to the next one. I don't know if you noticed this, but you can't see this if you're listening on this podcast, but a car has parked perfectly outside of my studio where the sun is shining directly. It just moved into the spot and you can see it flashing on my face and people walking by.
It's added a glow. You've got a really nice glow about you.
I've been in the studio for 7 years. This has never once happened. And just right now I'm like, who is shining a spotlight in my face? I swear, officer, I haven't been drinking. Anyway, sorry, podcasters, that you don't get to see the joy. But go to our Facebook page. You can watch this video and you'll see what I'm maniacally talking about in my face. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show today. Neil and JC, Weldwerks and Alvarado Street, respectively. You guys are badasses. You're making such great beer. And, that you took the time with us today is just so much appreciated. I know that everyone's going to love to hear your input today. So thanks so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
And keep up the good work, man. I'm pretty sure Alvarado Street pays my rent at least like a month out of the year, maybe more. And Neil, you anytime you want to send more of it my way too, we're taking it.
Hey, and I'll just throw out the rumor. I think maybe Greeley's looking for a hop grenade. So I'll just throw it out there.
And I did tell you, I've got a restaurant in a box just sitting in Colorado. So
I know. It's like 25 miles from Greeley. So
yeah.
But awesome. Thanks again for having me, guys.
Yeah, you got it. All right, Matt. Well, thank you. We got more coming up. We've got several topics in the pipeline, and we publish the podcast a little bit spread out, but just hang in there. Matt and I both got too many other things to do all the time, but we're getting better at this, and we do have a stellar lineup for you. So stay tuned. Wherever your podcasts are downloaded. If you're watching this on Facebook, you can actually download the audio version too, and we're just going to try to get more and more of these. As long as Matt will put up with me, I think we're doing these.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. We appreciate it very much. Thanks to Firestone Walker for their support. Thanks to our guests and to Matt, and take care of yourselves and your beer out there. We'll see you next time.
Cheers.